Hey, this is Efrem Smith, and welcome to another episode of City Beats. So glad you're with us. This is a podcast, a show where we explore the issues, the challenges of being in the city, and how we advance the kingdom of God, how we transform lives and communities, how we empower people in the urban, multi-ethnic context. I'm so glad you're with us. And this episode is actually a bonus episode. So we are sneaking this one in because it is February, Black History Month. And so there is a topic that we're going to put in specifically for Black History Month. And with me, my guest is Denzel Peoples.
Hello, hello.
Denzel Peoples is a part of the youth ministry team. He's on staff with me at Bayside Church, Midtown, in the heart of Sacramento. But he is also a spoken word artist.
I am.
And one of the things that we hold in common, besides our love for hip hop, is our love for comic books,
Yes.
our love for superhero movies and series. I think we could say we are urban Black nerds.
I would agree with that.
Yes.
I like that term.
So we're urban Black nerds, and so we're going to explore how African American stories, urban stories, work their way into comic stories, into superhero stories. And we're going to get there in a few minutes. But before we get there, I want to spend the first part of this episode, this bonus episode, talking about how we entered into our love for comics. So I'm going to start with me. I grew up in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And so in the summer months, when school was out and the weather wasn't freezing cold, me and my friends would meet at the end of the block on the corner, and we would bring our comics.
Wow.
We would bring our Superman, our Spider-Man, our Flash, our Thor, and we would read them and we would trade them. And that was kind of my introduction into loving comics and comic story arcs, loving superheroes was, I would do chores, at home, or I would, do stuff for my grandmother, whether it was yard work or other stuff she needed done. And at the time, if my grandmother or my parents or somebody else in the neighborhood that I was doing work for would give me a couple dollars, man, back then, $2, you could go down to the drugstore and you could get, for me, I would get a big gulp. I would get some Twinkies and I would get some comics.
Wow.
Because back then, you could get a couple comics,
Yeah.
for 50 cents. You
Yeah.
could get 2 comics. And so I would look forward to going to the drugstore and getting the latest issue of Spider-Man, of Superman, of Thor, Fantastic Four. That's kind of my introduction into comics. How about you?
For me, it's interesting. So what turned into a love for comics started off as a love for anime and cartoons. So when I was younger, I was watching, the reruns of the Super Friends and things like that from the 70s. But I was also watching some of the newer stuff that was coming out. And I was a big anime guy, Dragon Ball and Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon and things like that. And so we would trade cards, kind of like you traded comics, like you were saying. And that led into more of a love for superheroes and transitioned into like the big movies started coming out. So X-Men came out the year 2000 and Spider-Man came out 2002, I want to say 2003 maybe. And so those bigger budget movies started coming out with superheroes in it, and it began this age of the modern comic book movies. Of course we had the 70s Superman movies, 70s and 80s Superman movies, and the 90s Batman movies and things like that. But really what the current day, MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the DCEU, the DC Extended Universe, what these big, gigantic, modern franchises, which Avengers Endgame just made more money than any other movie ever, right? But they have to pay homage to what happened starting in the year 2000 with the first X-Men movie with Hugh Jackman and Halle Berry and just all of them. So it was really the comic book movies that made me say, whoa, well, there's a different world to this. There's more story here. Like, besides just going to the movies and watching this or watching this on tape, like, I can go and I can read this. I can open this up, and there's decades worth of stories with these characters that I've fallen in love with on the screen, that I didn't know, and so that's where this came from for me.
See, you're giving away our age gap because, like, you know, I'm 50 years old, and so I'm going to 7-Eleven and Woolworths and O'Toole's drugstore in Minneapolis, and if I'm at 7-Eleven, I'm getting a big gulp and some Twinkies, or if I'm at O'Toole's, I'm getting a Hostess apple pie and a soda, and then I'm buying comics. And at the same time, I'm seeing some of those comic book characters come to life on TV. But when I was a real young kid, I mean, it wasn't until later that all of a sudden Christopher Reeve played Superman in a major movie. And so for me, I started in the comics. And then, every once in a while you'd get an after school, cartoon program like Spider-Man, Spider-Man, friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. So you would get that, or like even, before Christopher Reeves, like, I mean, going way back to Superman in black and white, or Batman and Robin with Adam West playing Batman. So I remember, but for me, it was, I was in the comics. And every once in a while, whether it was Batman and Robin on TV or the Spider-Man cartoon series, you would see the superhero characters from the comics come to life on television, come to life at the movie theater. But for you, it was the anime, it was the cartoons themselves, whether it was the Justice League, reruns, and the Legion of Doom, or Amazing Spider-Man and Friends, or like you said, the Asian influenced anime, and then that got you into the comics or the graphic novels.
Right, exactly, because those animes themselves come from the mangas, and mangas are the graphic novel versions of the Japanese. They're essentially comic books themselves. They're Japanese comic books, and so that's what kind of got me into, like you said, those graphic novels. But I do think, like, all of these things are connected, and I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit, but comic books, superheroes, all of these fictional stories have a way of representing what the world needs at the time. And we'll talk about this because it does relate to Black history. It does relate to the Watchmen series and things like that we'll talk about. But Marvel and DC both have a way of trying to either bring you an escape from the evil that's going on in the world, or to show how you can relate and how you can be the characters that you see on the page. I jumped off my bed and I did this, like pretending to be Spider-Man. And though I didn't actually have superpowers, there were things about Peter Parker that I could relate to. There were things later on when Miles Morales came out that I could relate to. And that's what superhero comics are supposed to do. They're either supposed to inspire hope, to give you an escape, or relate to you in a way that makes you be like, man, like this is kind of me. This is how I feel. Even though I don't have superpowers, even though I'm not working at the newspaper or things like that, there are some storylines that connect to some of the things that are going on in my life. And that's why, as we continue, even though it's been for some of these characters like Batman and Superman, 70 years that they've been around, they continue to evolve in a way that tries to draw us in.
Yeah, starting to take the turn of how this connects to urban issues, urban life, and specifically African American life and experience. It was interesting. This was a new thing for me. I was at the barbershop a month ago. And so the barbershop I go to is predominantly African American. Right. There's also a Latino brother that's cutting hair in there. So there's a few Latino brothers that come in there. Every once in a while, a white kid to come in there because they want to fade, they want an urban look. Yeah. But I'm sitting in this African American barbershop. Shout out to Another Look. Rob Brown. That's my barber. And there's a young African American. I'm thinking he's like somewhere between 18 and 20, and he's arguing with his barber, who's probably in his 20s, about who has the most street cred as a superhero.
Oh, wow.
And they're going back and forth. Like one of them, like the guy in the chair is talking about Batman.
Okay.
And the barber's talking about Iron Man.
Okay. Okay.
And so at first I'm thinking, okay, they're talking about two superheroes, even though a debate for another episode is if Batman is a real superhero.
Okay,
because that's a big debate. Some people say he's a vigilante, not a superhero, but you could say the same thing about Tony Stark.
I was going to say the exact same thing.
You know what I mean? But I brought that up because I was like, here I am in the city, in a predominantly African-American barbershop, and an African-American millennial barber and an African-American millennial getting his haircut are arguing over who has the most street cred in the superhero world. But they're talking about two white guys that, even though Bruce Wayne and you know his superhero character Batman are in the city of Gotham, and you know Tony Stark is, you know, depending on which story arc and that you're reading. I mean, sometimes he's like in L.A., but even when he's in L.A., he's like in Malibu or something. You know what I mean?
L.A., New York,
or he's in New York. But I mean, you're talking about two very wealthy guys, and I bring this up because when I first stepped in to the comic book world as a kid, it was a fantasy world where, like you mentioned earlier, like I would go in my backyard and I would take a bed sheet without my mom seeing. And my mom watches these episodes now, so sorry, Mom, but I would take a bed sheet from the laundry room. I'd say, well, it's already dirty anyways, it's dirty clothes, and I would take it and I would tie it around my neck, and I'd run in the backyard flying like I was Superman or pretending I was Batman. But if I'm honest, I was pretending to be somebody outside my world. So, you know, if you're, excuse me, if you're, for a minute, you know, if you're listening to this, because some people are listening to this, but if you're watching it, I've actually got some comics and graphic novels in front of me and Denzel. And so, like, one I've got here is a 1969 Flash comic from 1969. And you're seeing Flash on the cover, but again, Flash, just stick with me for a moment. Flash is a white guy. You know, here I've got, you know, an old Spider-Man comic here. Man, this one right here, man, it was only 40 cents when it was originally sold. And this one, again, Peter Parker is Spider-Man. If you look on here, all the characters look like they're white. So even though the stories take place in cities like New York or a fictional part of New York called Gotham, none of these superheroes looked like me until all of a sudden I came across a superhero from Harlem, Luke Cage. And for the first time, I saw a superhero that looked like me. Like, and it does, I don't know about you, I'm gonna let you talk about it, but it did something to me deep when I was like, okay, I'm into these comics because they take place in cities. I'm growing up in a city, Minneapolis at the time, but man, when I saw Luke Cage and said, not only do these stories take place in an urban environment, but here's a superhero that looks just like me. His skin is brown like mine. He's talking from, on some level, my experience being black in the city. Did you have an experience like that, whether it was through the cartoons or the movies, when you first encountered superheroes of color? Is there a specific hero, person you think of and that you identified with? Absolutely.
The farthest back I can go, I think, for me, is the John Stewart Green Lantern.
Wow. Yes.
I grew up watching the Justice League and what spun into the Justice League Unlimited series. And the original, the Justice League, it followed the 6 core members of the Justice League. And in this iteration, those core members were Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, The Flash, Martian Manhunter, and the John Stewart Green Lantern. And so on this group of superheroes, one of the main people was John Stewart. Like, he was one of the original 6. And though that's not how it is in the comics, because John Stewart was second, he came after Hal Jordan. John Stewart, for me, that was that. And then once Justice League, the series, became Justice League Unlimited, the series, then it went from those 6 to hundreds of superheroes who identified themselves with the Justice League. And from there, you had John Stewart, you had many other characters who were African American, and then at the same time, on some of the same networks, you had Static Shock, who was a young teenager who was an African American, and you just began to see as the millennium turned, you started to see more and more representation in all of media, but specifically with comic book related things.
Yes. So I'm still into Spider-Man. I mean, I love the X-Men. I go back and forth between Marvel. I tend to like DC more in the graphic novel comic world, and then in film and like live stream series, whether it's through Netflix or that kind of thing. I tend to like Marvel more, but I go back and forth. But I'm saying there's something to, man, I can get it. I can find myself at different seasons really getting into a Spider-Man series, really getting into a Batman series. But there is something about these characters of color. I mean, Miles Morales, African American and Puerto Rican, as Spider-Man. I mean, I remember. There was controversy about this.
Absolutely, there's
a young man of color was going to replace Peter Parker as Spider-Man. Like, first of all, I was tripping out about this because this stuff is fictional. Yeah. So first of all, it's not real. It's a fantasy world. But there were actually, from my remembrance, I don't know if you remember this, like when they first were introducing Miles Morales as the new Spider-Man, and even some rumors out there that there might be an animated film or there might be a movie, with the Miles Morales character. There was like outrage. Yeah. There were white people that were like, "Don't do that to my Spider-Man." Yeah. Spider-Man is supposed to be white. Yep. It was almost like, sometimes you shouldn't get this as much today, but there still is around, like, don't mess with my white Jesus. Yeah. Even though, like, Jesus wasn't born in Europe. Yeah. Jesus wasn't Italian. Yeah. Jesus was Hebrew. There's a lot of evidence you could even say that Jesus was Asiatic, African, Jewish. Yeah. He's North African Hebrew, or at least you could say he's a multi-ethnic Jew. But man, don't you mess with that white Jesus trying to make him brown. That's in the Christian faith tradition, for some people, that's outrage. Yeah. That you take the European look off Jesus. Yeah. And so that's one big debate right there. Jesus. The Jesus of Scripture not being white, but let's just stick here in the comic book world. I mean, people getting mad that under the Spider-Man mask could be a black boy, a brown boy. Yeah, yeah. It's. I think it's tough for people to have to. I think something that happens in the Watchmen series. This relates to what we're talking about. Something that happens in the Watchmen series is that people oftentimes can't remove their opinions about something from also their racial biases. And so what happens is when something happens, like, let's say replacing Peter Parker with Miles Morales, then it's like, well, why do you have to do that? Like, why do we have to race bend everything? Like, everything is this is such a PC culture type of thing. And we really begin to
I don't know, we really begin to pull this thread that at the end, at the core of it, is a racist core. At the core, that's what it is. And I think that's why oftentimes in comic books, oftentimes in Marvel comic books specifically, the aim is to make sure that all people are represented. Because back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, when these characters were first being introduced, race wasn't a part of whether something was going to make money or not. It wasn't as big a thing. Every person on TV, every commercial, everything that was represented was a Eurocentric representation. And when civil rights began to happen, that's when some of these comic books, some of these artists, some of these creatives began to shift and say, hey, you know what, we need, if we're American, if we're an America that is representative of all people, then so does our art. Our art has to be representative of that. Yeah. But some people push back against that.
And in my opinion, Marvel did a better job in this than the DC universe, because Stan Lee, for some reason, I mean, introducing the Black Panther.
Yeah.
And I can't remember how far Black Panther goes back, if he goes back. I mean, of course, 70s. If not earlier.
He was definitely in the 70s.
Yeah. But, and so, because there was a lot of, wonderings. Did Stan Lee create Black Panther because of the Black Panthers, the militant group, that came out of the West Coast, out of Oakland, during the Civil Rights Movement, and someone like Luke Cage, and Power Man was another name they had for Luke Cage, coming out of Harlem at a time when, in the 60s, you had voices coming out of Harlem like Malcolm X. You know what I mean? And so, it raises the question: one, can a superhero be received by all of humanity outside of white skin?
I think that's a really good question. Something I was thinking about in preparation for this interview was the idea that oftentimes stories have to be told to people who don't relate to a specific topic in a way that makes it relatable to them. And so one of my favorite examples in all of comic book history is the idea that Professor X and the X-Men and Magneto are based off of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. Those two characters Stan Lee created as comic book versions.
You breaking something way down for me. You breaking this down. So, I think that's new insight for me right there.
And if you think about the history of the two, right? These two are people who are essentially fighting for the same thing. They're people who are not accepted by the majority of the world. They're fighting for that. One person on one side is saying, you know what, we should just forget them. We should forsake them. We should do our own thing. We're more powerful than them anyway. Like, we're different from them. We might as well accept it. The other person on the other side is saying, well, no. We're all humans. So let's love each other. Let's figure out a way
Professor
for us
X is the Martin Luther King
Professor
figure,
X is Dr.
and Magneto
King.
is the Malcolm X.
It's the Malcolm X character.
And Stan Lee was thinking about this when he created these two characters in the X-Men world.
Exactly. And so imagine being a white person in the 60s, right? Maybe some of the things that Dr. King or that Malcolm X you're not agreeing with, you don't like the things that are going on. But then you open up this comic book, this fictional thing that has these white characters, and you're like, man, the way that those mutants are treated is just so unfair. And it's to say, hey, let's create this metaphorical art form that people can see themselves in and realize, hey, maybe people in the real world are going through some of the same things that we're seeing in this graphic novel.
I'll never watch X-Men the same again.
You can't.
After you said
you can't.
I'll never watch the same again. And you know what? And let me bring gender into this for a minute, because the same way I could bring up, can a white audience receive a superhero of color? You know what? I had to ask myself a few years ago, why wasn't I buying more comics exploring the Storm story arc? Now, I started exploring Storm, the female African superhero character in the X-Men world, when her story collided with Black Panther's story, and there's a story arc where they get married.
They get married, yeah.
And or even like, you know, why didn't I read Wonder Woman? Like there was a part of me that thought, oh, Wonder Woman, she's for girls.
That's for girls. Yeah.
You know, Batman is for guys, Superman is for guys. So it raises another question. Can men receive a woman as a superhero?
That's a great question.
Can a woman be the ultimate superhero that even the men would look to and say that hero figure will cause me to reflect more deeply? Because I think what the comic book world, a gift of the comic book world, the superhero world to humanity is getting us on some level to tap into the hero in each and every one of us. That there, I mean, I'm going to talk like a pastor now. Here we go. Like you are loved by God, you are gifted by God, and there is a purpose on the inside of you to do heroic acts that transform communities, that transform lives. Like your superhero powers is you can extend grace and love and justice and reconciliation, liberation, empowerment to the vulnerable, to the broken, to the lost, to those that are in need of transformation and freedom and a new way of living life. And so, you know, in the Christian worldview, it's like the belief that the creator of the universe lives on the inside of human beings through the death and resurrection of Christ Jesus and the indwelling of the Holy Spirit.
Exactly.
Like that's radical, revolutionary, superhero-like thinking.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And that's why I'm so glad about the diversity in the superhero world, in the comic book world, because the more diverse the heroes are, when the heroes are male and female and Hispanic, Latino, Latina, African American, when they're from all parts of the world, it's a greater opportunity for people maybe to explore, to dream about the hero in themselves.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think one of the things that all superheroes have to go through in order to get to that superhero identity is a sort of baptism, if you will, in order to become this person with new life, in order to become this new creation, for T'Challa to become the Black Panther, for Peter Parker to become Spider-Man, for Clark Kent to become Superman. There is a tragedy, there is a death, there is something that happens in their lives which causes them to look back and to move forward. And I think that what the fictional comic book narratives and the non-fictional biblical narrative both shows us is that there's unlimited possibility when we use our past as something that propels us forward. And I think that Jesus shows us that in being a man who does not come from money, who was the product of a teenage pregnancy, who grew up without his actual father in the house, but had a stepfather in the house, who was beaten and arrested and persecuted by the government, and someone who was killed by the government, and someone that was a poor man, and someone who was homeless. Like all of those things that are a part of Jesus are what makes Jesus who he is. And it's not the Tony Stark or the Bruce Wayne story. In essence, it is the Miles Morales story. It is the John Stewart story, or all of that. And it's my story. It's your story. It's the urban story. And that's why I think the gospel and these comic books are so attractive.
Yeah, and I do have hope that the story of superheroes of color don't just reach my heart and your heart, but they're truly reaching the world. I mean, that's what I think is so powerful about Black Panther. Yeah. I mean, the thing about Black Panther is that movie came out a couple years ago or so now.
Yeah,
and man, I mean,
17?
it was a blockbuster film. Incredible. I mean, the world went to see Wakanda.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was, and so it, for a predominantly African American cast,
Yeah.
to have that kind of impact
Yeah.
on the screen gives me hope that that all of humanity on some level will receive these stories of heroes that are unlike them.
Yeah.
That you don't have to be moved by a superhero just because they represent your ethnicity,
Exactly.
or the story is like so aligned with your upbringing and the neighborhood you grew up in.
Yeah.
And so that gives me hope. But I'm hoping there's something from that it shows up real in our day-to-day living, because our nation, the United States of America, is a diverse but yet deeply divided nation.
Exactly.
And so my hope is that, and I think that's why I'm so interested in comics and in superhero movies, because my hope is that these heroic stories and how these stories are being told in such a diverse, mosaic way can bring healing into a divided land, especially if we can get beyond the fantasy of the superhero stories to the real opportunities for spiritual transformation on the inside of ourselves. Okay, I want to do this now because we've been teasing and alluding to Watchmen. Yeah. So one of the greatest, if not greatest, graphic novels ever written, Watchmen.
Yeah.
This graphic novel became a movie in the 90s. Just in general, the story arc is about a group of superheroes that they were known as the Watchmen, and these superhero figures were active. I think if I remember this story right, because I've read this a couple times, but it's been so long, through like the 60s into the 70s, and they retire, but all of a sudden someone is killing the Watchmen. And so for the most part, you're this huge graphic novel, it's like you're getting background on all the different heroes that make up the Watchmen. You're learning about their vulnerabilities and their weaknesses, that even though they're superheroes, many of them are carrying baggage and pain in their life. And you're also trying to figure out too, who is killing them? Yeah. Who's offing them now that they're retired? Yeah. So HBO in 2019 decides to do a whole new take on the Watchmen.
Yeah.
And there are two things that are very different about the Watchmen series on HBO than was in the graphic novel and in the 1990s movie, and that is African Americans are in the HBO series of the Watchmen. Excuse me. Regina King is the main actor in Watchmen, and she is this heroic figure. And I don't want you. I've watched the whole thing. You're a few episodes in, so you're a little late to the party. So I don't want to say so much that I spoil it.
It's all right.
But you're enough episodes in, and if you haven't watched it yet, I don't want to spoil it for you. But I encourage you, man. This is what is so powerful and why it's connected to Black History Month about this Watchmen series on HBO. Yeah. It is told from the backdrop of the 1921 Tulsa massacre. Yeah. If you don't know the significance of that event, I was actually in Tulsa, Oklahoma just a few weeks ago. And so after slavery, and so you get past the ending of slavery after the Civil War, you come out of the 1800s into the 1900s, and so in the early 1900s, miraculously, in a powerful way, there are pockets around the country of African American communities where African Americans are millionaires, where African Americans are owning banks, African Americans are dentists and doctors. I mean, there are these communities, and so one particular community in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It was known as Black Wall Street because of the number of black millionaires. It was like W.E.B. Du Bois' talented 10th, like realized, right? And so what happens is there is a revolt from white people. And if I get the story right, either a young black man supposedly looked wrong at or whistled at or flirted with a white woman. And then the story kept getting bigger and bigger of what actually happened between this young black man and this white woman supposedly. And that then led to white supremacists, white terrorists going in and burning down Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I mean, burning down, killing people. So that means, can you imagine being an educated, wealthy, influential, good African-American citizen of this nation, doing good, living out the Constitution, living out the core principles of what America's supposed to be about. Prosperity. Everybody gets a chance and an opportunity to work hard and get educated and own your business. And you do it. You fulfill the American dream. And then on one day, it's all taken away. Or in a series of days, it's taken away. So think about that for a moment. Because that part is not fantasy. That part is not comic book. That really happened. And it just didn't happen in Tulsa, Oklahoma in the 1990s. I'm sorry, in the early 1900s. And so this was 1921. So I want to get that right. I didn't mean to flub there and say 1990s, but I'm trying to say in the 1900s, which is not that long. I mean, relatively speaking, you know, because next year will be 100 years since the Tulsa Massacre. That's not that long ago. So if there are people that doubt the impact of racism that still lingers, I mean, how do you recover from that when you do everything right in this country? When you do what you're supposed to do, work hard, keep your nose clean, quote unquote, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and it's taken away by an anti-black force that doesn't want black people to be productive, wealthy, powerful, influential citizens. But then years later, people will say, well, why is there so much gang activity in the black community? Why is there so much drug dealing in the black community? Why are there broken families in the black community? Why are there babies out of wedlock in the black community? How about every time the black community has worked to be the positive, right, good citizens of America that we should be, there are anti-black forces that set it on fire, that burn it down, that rape it, that pillage it. That is not an indictment on all white people. But that's Black history. Like if people want to know, why do we need Black History Month? I say this, until everybody in America understands massacres like the Tulsa Massacre of 1921 and grieve about it, and we start thinking about what we do to repair the after effects of the 1921 Tulsa Massacre, we need Black History Month every year. So man, that was a lot there. I hope that don't push you away from tuning into City Beats. I mean, but we got to get real. We got to get real with this.
No, I think our country has yet to be in a state of repentance for what has happened to people of color and specifically to the Black community. Because it is true, all the way up until the 1860s, you had slavery where aside from the people of color who'd already come to the nation before Christopher Columbus and all that stuff, like Africans that were brought here to be servants, to be slaves. And then there's freedom from slavery. But then for another 100 years, there is the anti-blackness that is racism, that is, you know, the pushback of civil rights and all that stuff. And for years and years, and then after civil rights in the 1960s, then there's just more and more and more. And like you said, every time our community tries to pull itself up and to be that, there is pushback. And so what do you do? What do you do as a young Black person if there's always pushback to your prosperity, to you increasing yourself? What happens to you is the things that we see going on in our community. And then there's our art, there's our music that tells our story.
So, I mean, when I think about Watchmen using the Tulsa Massacre as the backdrop, you know, Regina King in that starring role, I mean, that's powerful, right?
Yeah. So if you haven't seen the series, Regina King plays a character in the modern day who comes from this line, this generational line that she begins to follow throughout the series, where her parents are killed. Her grandfather was this person of legend, that legend doesn't, of course, accredit to him because he's a Black man. He had to disguise himself. And then his parents were also killed. And how all of it is connected to just the Ku Klux Klan and racism, and it just plays throughout their entire family lineage, and it bubbles up, and you forget for 2 or 3 episodes that this is a comic book show, that this is about superheroes, about Dr. Manhattan who can teleport and has all these crazy powers and all these retired super. You forget about that because you're watching what could be, in essence, a modern day play out of something that actually could happen. Someone who is a descendant of someone who was at the massacre in 1921. Like, this could actually be happening. She could be a police officer. She could, and it's just really good how it draws you in with the real life history of it all, and yet it's still this comic book sequel. It's amazing. It's good.
Yeah, I mean, well, what is universal in this take on Watchmen with African Americans and their story at the forefront of the arc is that it seems like to me there's this universal story in the comic book, in the superhero world, that heroes rise out of suffering. Yeah. So absolutely, Superman, the suffering is what's going on his planet. Yeah. And the unrest between his people. Yeah. And so he's sent to Earth, you know, by his parents in order to save his life in the midst of suffering. You know, Bruce Wayne's parents are shot and killed. Yep. And out of the suffering, you know, he rises. And so the same is true in this new take on HBO of Watchmen. It's just what's unique here is that the heroes are coming from the standpoint of African American suffering. Yeah. And what causes tension when you watch it is having to decide if you can receive the fact that throughout American history, African American suffering has been deeply tied to African Americans' relational connection to white Americans. Yeah, yeah. And to white systems and institutions and power structures. Now, I know that's where it gets a little edgy because, you know, some of my white brothers and sisters would say, well, are you blaming every white person for this? Are you? Or they're like, oh, well, wait a minute. Why does it have to be about that? And I'm like, because we have to deal with what is true, with what is reality. I mean, the Tulsa Massacre, it disrupted, it dismantled, it killed African American progress in a community that was known as Black Wall Street. Absolutely. And so for an African American hero to rise up is to rise up in the midst of that specific American story and its racialized suffering. Yeah.
I think that what oftentimes, especially in the Christian circles too, is that because we have such a heavy focus on the gospel and the saving of Jesus, which is absolutely 100% the culmination of everything. But because we have such a focus on that, oftentimes we take a step back from real world issues and we just chalk it up to sin and say, well, that's sin and we just need to preach more. We need to preach the gospel more. And that is true. But I think what we need to realize as Christians is that because of sin, certain things have happened that we absolutely have to acknowledge. We have to acknowledge the fact that because of sin, racism is a thing. That because racism is a thing, that racism is built into the DNA of our nation, of our justice system, of our government, of the executive branch, of things like that. We have to acknowledge those things, and then because of that, we're able to say, okay, now how can we fight sin? Yes, it's by preaching the gospel. Yes, it's by evangelizing the people. But we also have to look at those things, acknowledge those things, and we have to go head first into dismantling those things in different ways. How do we bring about justice, God's justice, in the world, in an unjust system? How do we do that? And there are methods, there are ways, there are organizations that are set up to do that. But I think oftentimes what Christians do, what Christians do is oftentimes that we just chalk it up to sin. It's just sin, and we just need to go harder in our preaching or whatever. And I think that God has graced us with different methods of focusing and tailoring in on specific types of sin and dismantling them.
Yeah, because just as evangelism and discipleship are significant strategies, tools of the gospel, so is justice.
Yeah.
So is reconciliation. Mm-hmm. So is peacemaking. Mm-hmm. So is from a foundation of humility, engaging others for transformation.
Exactly.
So, man, I'm going to end it on that note. This is being so. I'm so glad that you're going to be a reoccurring guest here.
I'm
that
happy
this won't be the only time that people see you on City Beats. So we want to thank you for joining us for this special bonus Black History Month episode of City Beats. Yeah. And so I want to thank Denzel Peoples. And I don't know, maybe after this is encouraged you to go, check out some comic books. Go watch, Avengers Endgame again. Check out Black Panther. I don't know. That's what I'm going to do. Tonight, I'm going to go watch something that has something to do with a superhero. But I want to say this to you in all sincerity. I pray that you would know the creator of the universe in a deeper, more intimate way.
Absolutely.
So that regardless of your racial background, your economic class status, whether you grew up in the hood or in the suburbs or at the end of a dirt road in a small town, you would know that there is a beloved, gifted hero on the inside of you. Yeah. God bless, and join us again on City Beats.